All right, so my name's Robin Bourke. I'm an engineer with the Data Science Engineering team at Public Safety Canada. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about what we're doing on the emergency management side of things, supporting operations and other use cases, so tying in all of the excellent work that is being done in places like this into actual program decisions. I think I have the clicker. Okay, so I realize that this is a hydrologically offensive map. I'm just trying to see who is awake at this point in the day. Probably need to take a minute to address Canada-US relations. I think that's probably important. America is our neighbor and our closest friend. We have heard Canada referred to on some late night talk shows as America's hat. We don't really see each other or see ourselves that way. I just want to put to you today that in Canada, we flip it around. We sort of see America as Canada's beard. So I challenge all of you to unsee that for the rest of your lives. All right, so current state of data science and engineering in federal emergency management. So we are behind some of our G7 partners. I think Derek's presentation did a good job of highlighting some of these things and some of the directions that we want to go. We have a government operations center that manages coordination of emergency response at the federal level. We've had a couple of times where the federal government has directed us within public safety emergency management to try and fix this. So in 2021, our Prime Minister Trudeau at the time directed Public Safety Canada to incorporate the use of data science in all aspects of emergency management. In 2024, our Chief Science Officer produced a report specifically around strengthening the use of science in emergency management in Canada. So the team that I work on, so my very quick sort of background intro, I was in consulting for 10 years, came to the federal government for Natural Resources Canada, more on the technical H&H side of things, and then gravitated to public safety, really to focus on the risk elements of our work. So Public Safety Canada is a little bit like DHS. We have a whole bunch of different stuff in our portfolio. We have border security, cybercrime, counterterrorism, all these kinds of things. We also have an emergency management branch, so that's where I work. We didn't have a data science engineering team when I started. We spent the last 6 years building up this capability within the emergency management field at the federal level. It's been very challenging, but we've been able to do some really interesting stuff over the last several years. So we have 4 main programs that we work on. One is our post-disaster recovery program, so we call it DFAA in Canada. So when there's a major flood event or wildfire, any kind of disaster, the federal government gets activated. We have the Government Operations Center that steps in and coordinates response. And then after disaster, the provinces and territories will come to the federal government for financial aid for people that were affected, didn't have insurance, this kind of thing. We were also directed to stand up a low-cost flood insurance program for the country. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that specific use case in this presentation to give you a bit of a sense for our workflow. We spent the last few years developing our flood risk ratings for the entire country. So we now have low, moderate, high, and extreme flood risk ratings. This is really a communication tool. Was a precondition for setting up a flood insurance program in Canada. So that's been an interesting piece of work. And then that will be available through a digital resource. Anybody in Canada can go on, address search, and see a flood risk rating and the flood types that they're affected by at their location. So what we do on our team is we use hazard exposure vulnerability to risk chain, and there are a lot of different ways we can define and identify a risk. So what we're really trying to focus on is thinking of the end user or the end decision point that is going to be taken, and then figuring out from there what's everything we know to be able to answer a very specific risk question. Because we can define risk in an almost infinite number of ways, and for emergency managers, the way that we're defining risk is different than we need on the financial risk side of things, and so on. So we spend a lot of time, like half the battle is really articulating with our end users what is the very specific risk question they're trying to answer, and then from there we figure out what are the building blocks we have to get there. Can we answer that question, or does the question need to be modified? But that is a lot of what our team does. So just a very quick history of how we manage floods in Canada. So in 1954, every once in a while, there's a hurricane that says, you know what, I really want to see this beautiful country of Canada, and it comes all the way up, and so we do have hurricanes from time to time. In 1954, there's a big hurricane hit the city of Toronto. The city of Toronto sort of wraps around the western edge of Lake Ontario. Does anybody know how many ravines we have in the city of Toronto? Anybody like to take a guess? 4? Anyone else? We have 150 ravines, city of Toronto. And so what happens is, for a major flood event like this, all the ravines fill up with water. So this was a major incident in Canada. One of the good things that came out of this was how we managed water in Ontario. So everybody was moved out of the ravines. And so Toronto is actually a pretty flood-resilient city for fluvial and flash flooding. It also created this system of conservation authorities. So there are 32 or 33 conservation authorities that manage flooding at the watershed level in Ontario. Under our constitution, water management is really a provincial and territorial jurisdiction. So there are federal roles. So from the 1970s to the 1990s, we had our big first flood mapping program in Canada. It was a joint effort between the federal and provincial governments. Produced about 2,000 flood hazard maps. These were regulatory areas. The program kind of went away in the 90s, and then the side effect of that was provinces stopped regulating in those zones. We've since had a lot of development in flood hazard zones that were identified in those areas. The flood damage reduction program came in following the 2013 Calgary and Toronto floods. These are major flood events. It became apparent at that time that Canada didn't have really access to any flood insurance. So the National Disaster Mitigation Program was a $200 million program for flood mapping, small-scale risk assessments, risk assessments and small-scale mitigation projects. After that, we had the flood hazard identification and mapping program, so that's a couple $100 million more for flood hazard mapping across the country. On First Nations communities, we have First Nations Adapt, and that sort of brings us to the current state today. So we've had a whole bunch of these different programs kind of thrown together over the years. All right, so I'm going to talk about one very specific workflow, just to give you a bit of a sense for what we're doing. So this is working on the financial risk case. So Canada has not had access to flood insurance. So starting in 2013, after those big floods, the flood insurance industry said, nobody here has coverage. There was kind of a big public outcry about that. Nobody realized they didn't have flood insurance. So the insurance industry said, okay, it's probably in the long run better for us to just offer coverage to all these people and pay out all these claims, even though they don't have flood insurance. But the federal government's going to have to do a whole bunch of stuff to make this viable, because we just haven't had a market at this point. But the really big question is, who ends up paying for what? So obviously we spent a lot of time talking to people about the National Flood Insurance Program in the United States. There's a model in Spain that we've looked at. There's one in France. There is Flood Re in the UK. But ultimately with the flood insurance program, it comes down to who is going to pay for what. And that's what we really need to try and figure out. So on our team, we are, as I said, a little bit behind where the States is in a lot of areas. What we have access to in Canada is private sector models. So there are a number of firms that do global scale and continental scale flood hazard mapping, JBA, Cat Risk, Aon Impact Forecasting, and Fathom in the UK. So starting in 2018, we did the first kind of assessment of all of these types of models within Canada to see if there was effective use cases for deploying these things. So effectively, these are done at a 30 by 30 meter grid resolution for the entire country. They will give you 8 or 9 different return period floods. Flood generating mechanisms include fluvial, pluvial, and coastal. So at this time, the federal government hadn't really seen these tools. They're widely in use by the insurance and financial sectors, but the government hadn't seen them. So we did an assessment in 2018 and decided that yes, these have some really good utility. They fill a gap and will help us solve some of our current problems. They're obviously lower resolution and higher uncertainty than a local scale flood hazard map, but still useful. In 2020, we procured 3 of the models, and then in 2022, we used these for our first financial risk analysis. Before we did that, we did a really deep dive on the quality assessment of these models. So it's probably a little hard to see from these pictures, but essentially we had 500 local scale engineered flood hazard maps for Canada, and we did a comparison of overprediction, underprediction, and agreement to come up with a critical success index. We also, in areas where we had discrepancy, went in and did a bit of a deeper dive to figure out what was going on. So we used those 3 models for the first run, and then in 2024, the issue with the first models was that they're really tight contract restrictions. So in 2024, we went out for an open tender procurement to have a really wide sharing license where we could actually share a lot of these products. So the workflow, so we have the hazard piece. We have 3 different models in the hazard piece. On the exposure side, what we need is building location, footprint, and attributes for every residential address in Canada. This is not available from any one source. We had to go and develop this from a whole bunch of different sources, do a lot of data quality control and data synthesis. We were able to work with some private sector vendors to get a bunch of the house level data. But it doesn't always exist. So it doesn't always exist in the public sector and private sector. Sometimes we need to build something. We try not to build things on our team. We're only about 8 people. Well, we try not to build data products because we just don't have the time or capacity, but every once in a while we have to. So we built a product here called Canada Structures. It's available through Open Data portal for the government of Canada. And essentially, this data set will give you a whole bunch of building level information for every residential address, every building in Canada. So we have our hazard and our exposure. And then on the damage estimation side, every one of the 3 models that we were using, JBA, CAT-RISK, and Aon, each one of those models had their own damage estimation methodology. In addition to that, we worked with a company called Fathom in the UK to develop a 4th damage estimation methodology. And by doing that, we were able to run 6 different financial risk analyses for every residential address across the country. So this is what it kind of looks like when it comes out. We have all of our address points and a whole bunch of information there that we can use to conduct financial risk analysis. So why are we doing this? Because we need to be able to provide this information to the actuarial teams who are then going to go and try and decide the answers to that fundamental question of who pays for what. So obviously a flood insurance program, this involves really big levers. And so we are getting into a market and manipulating that market, and you can do that in ways that are really helpful and really effective, and you can do that in ways that are counterproductive and harmful. So by providing this level of location level, community level, provincial and national level financial loss estimates, the actuarial teams can start to figure out, if we design a program in different ways, what are the levers going to be and what are the end results going to be. So a few interesting things came out of this. Actually, I'm going to back up one slide. A few interesting things came out of this. We have a couple different sources of information for major loss events in Canada. So we have all of the disaster financial assistance arrangement claims. So these major disasters that are occurring, major floods in Canada, when the federal government gets activated, we help out through the Government Operations Center and we provide funding after. And then we also have everything on the financial modeling side. So we're going to do another show of hands. The major disaster, the big floods that are hitting Canada, put your hand up if you think that those are happening at the 200 and above year return period. Okay, 100 and above. Okay, 80 and above. 50 and above. 20 and above. So interestingly, what we've seen is from the financial loss modeling, we see a really big jump when the annual exceedance probability, but we're going to the return period for this presentation. Between the 20 and 100, that's where we see the biggest jumps. And we see that as well on the disaster financial assistance claims. We've gone back and reassessed. It's interim work, so I can't share a lot of it right now. We're still checking it. But a lot of the loss that we're seeing from these major events that are hitting, people assume these are 100-year floods, 200-year floods. They're really between like 20 and 50, 20 and 80. So those are the events that are actually causing the most damage. And we're seeing that as well with the big jumps on the loss estimation side of things. All right, a couple of other things for what's coming up next. Our team is looking a lot at wildfire as well. So we've had a lot of bad wildfire seasons in Canada. We have 2 wildfire researchers. We have a major issue. This is an issue in the States, I know, is that insurers are pulling out. So flood insurance is something you add on to your home insurance policy. Wildfire is part of the home insurance policy. So if you're at high risk of wildfire, insurers can just pull out and you can't get home insurance, you can't get a mortgage. It's a problem. It's happening in the States. It's starting to happen in Canada. We've had wildfires last year where the disaster claims are being processed now. Our updated disaster financial assistance arrangement program includes mitigation funding on top of the funding that goes to make people whole after a disaster. The provinces need to know now where they can spend that money. So another use case we're looking at is articulating a very specific risk question for the DFA program of where can they actually spend that mitigation money. So again, that's a really specific question. The FIFRA, this is an image of the flood risk ratings we have for the whole country. low, moderate, high, and extreme, and a flood type. So that is now available as a data set. We are working with provinces and territories to make that available. That'll be going out through the portal. We're working on multi-hazard analysis. So we've done some work on where do we have overlapping high-risk wildfire and flood. And so, for instance, in Northern Ontario, there's a lot of overlapping wildfire and flood risk. Does anybody else know what also is in Northern Ontario? Anybody like to take a guess? Yep. Yep, mining. Absolutely, and a lot of Indigenous communities. So we have a lot of our smaller Indigenous communities exposed to both types of risk. Flood insurance program, Open Frank, I'll mention. This is a program, it's a big research program, well, big for Canada that we're funding, not as big as Cairo, but we're small but feisty. If you have questions about that, you can come and ask me. Martin Clark is very involved as well. And then we are also open to any collaboration. So certainly the last presentation from Derek, I've got a lot of questions. We're looking at going in some of the same directions you've gone, so that was very interesting. And just want to finish with saying that I realize that this has all been very fast. This presentation has probably raised more questions than it's answered. So feel free to come up to me at any time in the conference or send me an email after. And just a final disclaimer, I talked to Sagi about the way that we use the term, or he's used the term floodplain mapping used in Canada. So I had to put a disclaimer up about that. So that's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate the time.